Joseph was alone and friendless in a foreign land. When the traders arrived in Egypt, he was sold to Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard. Joseph, who was but a few days before had enjoyed everything he wanted in his father's house, was now a slave. Whatever he was asked to do, he did it well. Potiphar noticed and was so pleased with Joseph's work that one day he told Joseph that from now on he would be the overseer or boss of his house. That was a big promotion for a slave, and Joseph was very happy about it. All went well until Potiphar's wife began to cause trouble. She tried to get Joseph to do something very wrong, but Joseph refused. "How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" he said. Potiphar's wife was furious. Seeking revenge, she told her husband lies about Joseph. Potiphar ordered Joseph to be taken to prison. Poor Joseph, he had done nothing wrong. Yet, Joseph would not let himself be in despair, for God was still with him.
Well, good morning. It's good to see all of you today here at the early service. I appreciate anybody that gets up early enough to get here to church, just barely after the sun gets here, right? And I know it's hard. I'm not really a morning person myself, so I know it takes a little extra effort. But it is good to see you. And even if your eyes are still getting open, it's great to see you. Well, we continue our series today, Meant for Good. We are in the second installment of this, just getting started, so you haven't missed very much. If you have been missing or you do miss, it'll all be online for you, okay? Last week, we were in Dysfunction Junction, right? As we talked about Jacob and all of his many dysfunctional happenings and habits, and as the deceiver was deceived by his sons in chapter 37. And we also honed in on Joseph, who's the favorite son, who in last week's installment was betrayed and enslaved by his brothers. So story's already off to a great dramatic start. I've encouraged you to read, so you'll be ready to study with us as we go. We're going to just jump right past chapter 38 because it is pretty much more of the same, and Joseph is not in it. But chapter 38 has been called the worst chapter in the Bible. That'll make you want to read it, right? Well, let me tell you, these two chapters, 37 and 38, have already shown us a great deal about what it means when we say that God meant it for good. Because in chapter 37, where we were last week, if anyone or anything is the star of that story, the star is the providence of God, right? Because the brothers sold Joseph into slavery thinking they had shut him down and gotten rid of his dreams, but in so doing, they actually made his dreams come true ultimately, didn't they? In seeking to defeat God's purposes, they helped in their fulfillment. The providence of God, so hard to see sometimes, but it operates in your life and mine, even when it seems that the darkest clouds hover over our lives. God is at work. He is superintending the details. He's always at work on our behalf. So that's the big message from last week. Chapter 38, again, read that if you haven't. But really, it's not I don't think it is the worst chapter in the Bible. In fact, it may be one of the best chapters in the Bible if you want to focus on the grace of God, because it is absolutely unbelievable. In chapter 38, God takes the ruined lives of at least two people. He deals with Judah and transforms his life. He deals with Tamar, uses an awful situation for good. First child that she bears is a kid named Perez. We didn't have any Perezes this morning, did we? Perez is in the ancestry line of David and thus the ancestral line of Jesus. There is nothing more marvelous in all the world than the power of God's grace. And God so often uses that grace to make good what does not seem good at all. He forgives, he lifts up, he transforms. David Jeremiah says, if it is true that what is broken can never be unbroken, it is also true that what is broken can also be fixed. Only a God of grace could take a rebellious man like Judah and a wicked woman like Tamar and somehow use them in the line of our blessed Redeemer. But that's what God does. He redeems people. He came to save the Judas and Tamars and Jacobs and all the other rebellious people in the world. He claimed to reclaim the broken lives of his children. He is the God of all grace, and his grace abounds to you and to me. So there's chapter 37 and chapter 38. Providence and grace, and you can see what we mean by meant for good. Well, as we move into chapter 39, our focus changes just a bit to the topic of temptation. And God's grace is all over this one again as well. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Christian man who was kind of a modern martyr. He was killed by the Nazis because of his adamant faith. And Bonhoeffer writes about the anatomy of temptation. So let me share a quote with you, all right, as we get started in this topic. He says, "In our members there is a slumbering inclination towards desire, which is both sudden and fierce. With irresistible power, desire seizes mastery over the flesh. All at once a secret smoldering fire is kindled. The flesh burns and is in flames. It makes no difference what kind of temptation. It can be in many, many forms. But even a temptation such as desire for the beauty of the world can steal from us the joy of God. Joy in God is in the course of being extinguished in us, and we seek all our joy then in ourselves. At this moment, God is quite unreal to us. He loses all reality, and only desire for the creature, ourselves, is real, when the only reality is the devil. Satan does not here fill us with hatred of God, but with forgetfulness of God. The lust thus aroused envelops the mind and will in deepest darkness, and the powers of clear discrimination and decision are taken from us. At this point, it is here that everything within me rises up against the Word of God." I think all of us understand how temptation works. It's the oldest of inner conflicts in the human heart. It's the oldest of stories, perhaps almost in the Bible. There is not one person, including Christ, who has not struggled with temptation. And except for Christ, there is not one person who hasn't suffered the consequences of yielding to it. So indeed, there is something for everyone in this message. It is Mother's Day, but this message kind of skews toward the guys, so you ladies maybe take it a little bit easier today, but there's something for everyone here. When it comes to temptation, before we get into the text, there are a couple of assumptions that we make. First, we assume that to be tempted is always a sin. Hebrews 4:15 teaches that though temptation may lead to sin, it is not in itself a sin, okay? And that's good news for us. I've heard people say, if I were just stronger, I wouldn't be tempted. The truth of the matter is, probably the stronger you are, the more Satan is going to try to tempt you. So temptation itself is not a sin. Jesus was tempted, but he did not sin, okay? Second, we tend to limit temptation and we put it in one box, and we think it generally almost always focuses on some kind of physical temptation or fleshly temptation, which quite often it does. But in 1 John 2, verse 16, we are told that everything of the world, everything that drives the world is going to be found in one of three areas: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, or the pride of life. Okay, that gives us a breakdown of different kinds of temptation. Lust of the eyes, this is material temptation. This is that unnatural craving and desire for stuff, for things. It can be money. It could be something as big as a house or as small as a piece of jewelry, right? So you see something physical and you want it, right? Because you don't have it. That's the lust of the eyes. The second kind of temptation is the one that circles around pride. This one is incredibly rampant. Personal temptation. This is the lust for status, to matter and to be in charge, to be in control, to be seen as having power. It can be maybe something that people will work toward to gain recognition or fame or influence, and they will sacrifice their friends and their family. They will sacrifice whatever it takes, anything that gets in the way, in order to possess a title or a position. The sins that go with this temptation are interesting. Pride, of course, is the obvious one, but even the sin of discontentment, not being happy with our level of influence or control, right? All right, so those are the first two, lust of the eyes, the pride of life. The third one, and the one that we tend to default toward in thinking about temptation, is the lust of the flesh. And once again, we would be wrong if we think this is always about a sexual kind of temptation. It's about any kind of physical pleasure. It may be lust for cheesecake. Anybody have that? Chocolate. Yeah, now I'm getting warmer. Chili cheese dogs. Okay? These all fit into the lust of the flesh. And the sins that come with this one is maybe the temptation to do something that we shouldn't do, but sometimes even in the temptations that are sensual in nature is the temptation to do nothing. You can be tempted by your recliner to be lazy when you ought to be working instead, okay? You can also be tempted to be working by one of the others if you need to be resting instead. It's complicated, isn't it? This stuff is really hard. Regardless of the kind of temptation, and there are so many different kinds, all of us know the frustration of trying to stop a Goliath lust with a David will. And in our lesson today, we're going to look at Joseph in terms of his example of how to resist the enticements of sensual temptation. The New Testament has a lot to say about temptation. We read the verse from 1 John 2:16, lust of the flesh, the eyes, the pride of life. One of the other most definitive statements in the New Testament about this is James 1, verses 13 through 15, and it describes the process. We all know this because we've all been there, right? It says in James, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, okay? A lot of people have a problem discerning the difference between temptation and testing, tempting and testing. God can never tempt you. God will always test you, sometimes through the temptation that he allows Satan to bring into your life. He goes on, James does. He says, each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Isn't that a graphic picture? Sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. We all understand that. We've all been there. We all know how this shoe fits, okay? So as we move into Genesis 39, we could call this the testing of Joseph if we wanted to, and we'd be right. Let's read verse 1 and 2. Genesis 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Okay, a couple of verses there set us up. And there's a couple of things that are kind of conspicuously missing here. First, there's no mention of how long Joseph has been Potiphar's slave. I mean, the last time we saw him, he was being carted off by Ishmaelite slave traders. We don't know how much time has transpired. Maybe it's been a few months. May have even been a few years. We really don't know. Second, there's nothing mentioned here about the traumatic adjustments that Joseph has had to endure as a slave in a foreign land and culture. Remember, before all of this happened, he is used to having a doting old father and privileges as the favorite son that exempted him from doing the hard labor, right? The coat of many colors that he was given. Now he has to obey the commands of Pharaoh's chief officer, and he has to do whatever menial tasks he is asked to do as a slave. It took a lot for Joseph to survive even to this point. Okay? A lot has happened we don't see, but he is making it. But we're going to learn through the story that something special is at work in Joseph. Something incredible is paired with how God is meaning all of this for good. And this special thing that is working is happening in spite of the horrible circumstances. Let's pick it up in verse 3. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything that he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. So Joseph goes from being a piece of human traffic to a slave in Egypt to a guy who's in charge in the home of the Secretary of Defense. It's really not bad in terms of what could be happening to him instead. Pretty good situation. Notice Joseph didn't tell Potiphar that the Lord was with him. It says his master saw that God was with him. There's a word there about witness. And you know, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ and you're serious about your walk, people around you should be able to see that there is something different about you. And they should be able to see that God is with you in your life. Verse 4 says that Joseph found favor in Potiphar's sight. It doesn't say Joseph requested favors from Potiphar. Joseph earned the right to be respected and trusted. Well, it could go really good for him from this point, but no good deed goes unpunished, and we'll see that coming in just a minute. Verse 5. From the time you put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. Not only is God's hand on Joseph, it's also on Potiphar's house. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except for the food that he ate. Isn't that neat? I mean, I love how God is already working for good in this really tough story. His blessing, combined with Joseph's personal integrity, has inspired Potiphar's absolute confidence and trust. And along with that has come greater measures of responsibility and certainly greater measures of freedom for Joseph. But I want to tell you that sometimes success, however you measure it, can be the greatest test of all. Sneaking up behind all of these benefits comes a greater measure of vulnerability for Satan's attacks. A writer named F.B. Myers says, we may expect temptation in days of prosperity and ease, rather than in those of deprivation and toil. Not where men frown, but we should expect it where they smile and applaud and give the exquisite smiles of flattery. It is there that temptation lies in wait. Beware, if you go armed anywhere, thou must above all go armed there. The writer of Genesis sets the stage in this little bitty snapshot of Joseph's professional life with a personal aside in verse 6. Now, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. NIV says Joseph was well built and handsome. Okay, you got it? Joseph's a hunky hunkster, right? One good-looking kid. And this does not go unnoticed or unappreciated. And the next verses are kind of a setup for what is going to come. While busy Mr. Potiphar is appreciating Joseph's reliable business sense and his trustworthy nature, neglected Mrs. Potiphar is becoming increasingly preoccupied with Joseph's good looks. Verse 7 tells us, now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. Okay? Nothing like the subtle approach, right? Bold, very, very bold. And you know what? We can be very critical of her. She is not a God follower. She's a pagan, and she is just being driven by her worldly desires. Okay? It's what people of the world generally do. She's just doing what she probably is in a habit of doing. Mrs. Potiphar is becoming preoccupied with Joseph, and some of you guys, this will date me. There was a TV series when I was a kid called Lost in Space, and there was this robot, and every time something bad would come around, he would say, danger, danger, Will Robinson, danger. Remember that? Okay, you guys have no idea what I'm talking about. Sorry. Go find Lost in Space and watch it, okay? Any living man would be in grave danger in this situation, right? Joseph, this is one of the first chances we get to have a look at what Joseph is really made of. Verse 8. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Great speech, great logic. We'll talk about that later. But Mrs. Potiphar isn't moved a bit by it. She is interested in Joseph's attributes, not Joseph's arguments. And as is true for every single one of us, when the flesh is screaming, it is hard to hear the oncoming train, and it's hard to hear anything else. It's no wonder that Joseph's great argument kind of falls on her deaf ears. Well, let's analyze just a little bit about what's going on in Joseph's temptation, because we can see these things in our own lives. First, Joseph is in a tight spot, okay? The very place that he lived and worked, Potiphar's household, brought him daily face to face with very hard to resist temptation, Mrs. Potiphar. Joseph, by now, remember, is 17, 18, 19 years old. Okay, enough said about that. Second, her advances certainly must have flattered his ego. I mean, think about all the bad things that have happened to him. And we know that Joseph had an ego because we saw it earlier. He's been broken somewhat, but it must have been flattering to him, and it must have been affirming to him. After all that has happened to him, something that at least felt positive was coming in his direction. He knew better, okay? But it must have aroused in him some very powerful temptations. Third, the source of temptation was ever present. The scripture here tells us she pursued him day after day. That says in verse 10. Fourth, this woman pursued Joseph even when they were alone, especially when they were alone, when there was really no danger of their being detected. So everything is set up for the perfect disaster here. It's a very vulnerable time for Joseph, and no doubt Joseph is having a struggle with this. It doesn't show the picture of that, but I think Joseph is having to deal with this. He's having to work overtime. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer said earlier, the evil was trying to erode his powers of discrimination and decision. Satan is working. Final test for Joseph comes when Mrs. Potiphar resorts to more than just words. Verse 11. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. You know, for very good reason, in almost every instance in the New Testament, when the issue of sexual temptation is dealt with, we're told to flee. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, if you want to study that some more. We're told to run. Some temptations we're told to stand up against. We're told to resist. But when it comes to this kind, we're told to do just what Joseph did, get out of Dodge, because the Lord knows if we stay, we're likely to give in. It's true of all kinds of temptation. If you feed the hunger, the monster only grows. Well, we come in the story now to a crisis point. Trouble is about to come upon Joseph again with a capital T. A guy named William Congreve must have read what Solomon wrote when he wrote this: "Heaven has no rage like love to hatred turned, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned." And all of the emotions and desire that Potiphar's wife had felt all of a sudden blazes into a fury. She wants revenge for her rejection. And so we're not going to read verses 13 through 15, but she makes up a false report. She does a hashtag #MeToo, right? And this one's false. And she tells the servants around her she says, her version of what has gone on. And then it really gets sticky. Verse 16. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. And then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave that you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, 'This is how your slave treated me.' He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined." Wow, the travelogue for Joseph's getting pretty impressive. Okay, favorite son of Jacob, living life of luxury, pampering, all of a sudden in a pit in the wilderness, all of a sudden sold to Ishmaelite slave traders, the next turn dragged off in chains to Egypt. Then by a great turn of events, God working, he gets hired to be the master of the house of the Secretary of Defense there in Egypt, and now he's in a dungeon. Man, you got to have motion sickness pills to be Joseph. There's a lot going on here, and you can only imagine. I don't think we can imagine here living in America. Our prisons tend to be very, they're compared to the prisons that I've seen all over the world. Our prisons are humane places. They're terrible places to live, but they are nothing like what Joseph is experiencing here. It is not a country club. There's no television. There's no internet. It's a pretty bad place to be. Keep that picture in your mind. And what's even more amazing here, and it tells us more than we know, it's amazing that Joseph wasn't killed, because the penalty for a slave attempting what he was accused of would be immediate execution. So I have to wonder if Potiphar didn't know more of the story. I have to wonder maybe sometimes if Potiphar was more upset about losing his right-hand man than about the way his wife was behaving. I don't know. Have to wonder about that. Whatever we wonder about, the one thing that we know is Joseph did the right thing. He did exactly the right thing, but once he got outside, he didn't hear any angels singing his praises for doing the right thing. What he heard instead was the accusation of Potiphar's wife, an accusation that would hurl him from the heights of being the chief overseer for Potiphar to the depths of an obscure jail cell in which he's going to spend quite a bit of time. All right, pretty fast little story there, and a lot of amazing stuff going on. Let me leave you with some applications before we go today, okay? 6 very quick applications. Don't be afraid. I'll get it done in the right time. Number 1, accountability is your friend. Accountability is your friend. Several aspects in Joseph's position worked against him in this battle. And probably number 1 was just the fact that he was alone, and he's very secure. He's trusted. He has integrity. He has accomplishments, and he is praised by everyone that knows anything about him. And perhaps most dangerously, he has total autonomy. It's easy for us to forget that even though we think no one is looking, God is always watching, right? So accountability is your friend. And we tell guys all of the time in our men's ministry to make sure that you build levels of accountability into your life. Number 2, a good defense is the best offense. Mrs. Potiphar was very calculating, and she tried day after day to lure Joseph to follow her will. But Joseph also had to be pretty calculating to be able to withstand it. Joseph had thought about this. He had given careful consideration to this. He had come up with a plan as to how he could remain a man of integrity. She tried everything she could to convince him, but her words were in vain. His predetermined commitment to God saw him through. I heard a guy who was speaking once, and he said, most of us as believers make it our aim to not sin much. And he suggested instead that we are to make it our aim not to sin. So plan ahead. Number 3, be ruthless with your emotions. F.B. Meyer said, resist the first tiny thrill of temptation, lest it widen a breach big enough to admit the ocean. Remember that no temptation can master you unless you unlock the door and invite it in. It's a tremendous battle with our emotions, and all of us know this battle. But Joseph very clearly understands the battle that's going on. It says in one verse he refused, in another verse he identifies the temptation as a great evil, a sin against God. In verse 10, he doesn't even listen to her or stay there. Verse 12, he runs from the situation. You have to be ruthless with your emotions when you are tempted. Number 4, a word of caution. Today's pleasure may equal tomorrow's prison. One battle won is not the war won. And I know that when I am able to overcome temptation and in some way withstand temptation, it's easy to feel proud. It's easy to feel like I have done something big and I should be applauded. But the truth of the matter is, the devil doesn't give up easily on us. And just because you win one battle doesn't mean that the battle isn't going to come back to you tomorrow. So you have to really think in those terms. Number 5, failure is not final. This is good news, isn't it? Because when we fail, and every one of us have failed, right? Every one of us have succumbed to different kinds of temptation. We do it every day in different ways. But when we fail and we acknowledge our failures, we learn so very much about ourselves. And we gain just truckloads of humility as we come to understand how much grace we've been shown and given. And we gain strength in the areas where we're weak, because we are able to allow God to heal those wounds and build that bone that's broken back stronger. And in it all, we experience a tremendous amount of grace. And it's a good thing. The good news here is that God can repair broken, damaged, and failed hearts. This is a story in the Bible about a man who did something that is very difficult. He stood strong and he maintained his character. There are many other stories in the Bible about men who didn't. David probably being the most famous of those. And yet David, when he came to the point of brokenness and humility, was welcomed back into God's arms. And he is still remembered as a man after God's own heart. And isn't that a good thing? And the last one, number 6. Integrity typically has a high price. It's not easy to live lives as men and women with character. It's not easy to do the right thing when so many voices in your head are calling for you to do the wrong thing. It's not easy to take a stand and to hold on to the pathway that is the way that you should go. But if you want company along that road, just go to the cross. Because integrity has a price, and no one shows that more than Jesus Christ. He does everything right, and still he pays a tremendous price. Well, I love the story of Joseph. I don't like it sometimes because it hits pretty close to home, doesn't it? But I am encouraged by it, and I am built up by it as well. I'll tell you what, let's do. This is the last thing today. And since I kept you overtime last Sunday, I'm going to give you 4 minutes back today. Would you stand up with me? I'm going to pray, and we'll be done for the morning. Father, thank you for this picture of integrity. Every single one of us in this room understand what it means to fail when fighting temptation. And Lord, were it not for your grace, we would all be in a dungeon somewhere, because that is what we deserve. Lord, help us to see your grace every day and your providence, and help us to know that when we are strong, we encourage others who are fighting the battle. When we are strong, we are able to give you the praise and the glory for helping us to get through the temptation. And Lord, I pray for everyone in this room in the specific areas where they feel weak. And Lord, I thank you also that when we fail, your Spirit can convict us and show us where we are wrong. It can bring us back around to the right place, and you put our feet back on the path of integrity, and you forgive us completely. We thank you so very much for that. Help us to remember Joseph's character as we face our own tests in the week that is to come. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So good to have you here today. God bless you.
Hey, thanks so much for spending time with us today. If this is your first time or you need prayer requests or anything, we have a Connect card on our website, wacc.atx.org, that you can fill out, and we'll be in contact with you soon. Also, if you've been impacted today by this week's message or anything that we've done during service, we want to know, and you can let us know that by commenting below, or you can subscribe to our YouTube and follow us on social media at wacc.atx. Remember, at Washington Avenue, we are a community where real people experience real grace. We'll see you next week.